The night Violet Ashford arrived at the Dunmore ranch, she was carrying everything she owned in a canvas bag that had seen better days, and the only thing she asked for was work. She did not ask for kindness. She did not expect it. The man who answered the door was tall in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors tend to be. Not the tall of someone who grew up well-fed and comfortable, but the tall of someone the wind had stretched and the cold had hardened. His name was Callum Reed. He stood in the doorway of his ranch house north of Kamloops, British Columbia, with a lantern in one hand and the expression of a man who had already decided the answer was no before she had even opened her mouth. "I heard in town you needed a cook," Violet said. "Heard wrong," he said, and began to close the door. "Your ranch hand at the feed store said otherwise." There was a pause. The wind came down off the Thompson Plateau and moved through the pines like it had somewhere to be. Callum Reed looked at the bag. He looked at the woman holding it. She was young, 24, maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes, and a set to her jaw that told him she had already spent considerable energy getting to this porch, and was not about to spend any more on begging. He opened the door wider. "You cook breakfast by 5:30, he said. "You stay out of my office. You don't ask questions about the house." "Understood," said Violet. That was the beginning of it. The Dunmore ranch sat on a long stretch of land between two ridges, the kind of land that looked severe in winter and quietly beautiful in summer, and demanded respect in every season in between. Callum had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his, and somewhere in that chain of inheritance the idea of warmth had been lost. The house itself was clean and functional. Someone had cared for it once, that much was clear. But there were rooms that had not been opened in years, and a kind of stillness in the hallways that felt less like peace and more like avoidance. Violet did not ask about any of it. She cooked breakfast at 5:15, which Callum noted but did not comment on. She made oatmeal and biscuits and strong coffee, and set it on the table and stepped back into the kitchen before he sat down, because she had learned quickly enough that he preferred to eat alone. She cooked for the two ranch hands as well, brothers named Pete and Gus, who were grateful in the loud, uncomplicated way of men who had been eating their own cooking for too long. And she kept the kitchen organized and the larder inventoried, and the cast iron pan seasoned the way her grandmother had taught her. She did not talk much, neither did Callum. It suited them both. What Violet did not say, and what she had no intention of saying to anyone on that ranch, was that she had come from Merritt with $42, and a situation she was trying to put enough distance between herself. And she had left a man who had a talent for making small cruelties feel like her fault. And she had taken the first work she could find in the opposite direction, and she had told herself that the only thing that mattered now was getting through each day in one piece. She told herself this especially in the evenings, after the kitchen was clean, and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house settled into its nighttime silence. She would sit at the small table in her room, a room off the back hallway that had probably been a storage room once and still smelled faintly of cedar. And she would think about her situation with the careful, methodical attention of someone trying not to panic. She had enough for 3 months if she was careful. After 3 months, she would figure out the next thing. That was all she allowed herself. What she did not plan on was the cold. She had grown up in the interior, and she understood British Columbia winters in the theoretical way that people understand things before they have lived them fully. But November, on the Dunmore ranch, was a different category of cold. The kind that came through the walls at 3 in the morning and sat on your chest until morning. The kind that made the horses shift in the barn and the pipes groan and the ridge behind the property disappear entirely into cloud for days at a time. The wood stove in her room was small and needed feeding twice through the night if she wanted to stay warm. She got up to do it without complaint. She was not a woman who complained about practical things. It was on one of those nights, a Thursday in late November, the temperature somewhere around -18 outside, that Violet sat wrapped in her quilt on the edge of her bed and did something she had not done in years. She folded her hands in her lap and she talked to God, or to the ceiling, or to whatever it was that listened in the small hours of the night when there was no one else. She talked about her mother, who had died when Violet was 19 and left a gap in her life that had never quite closed. She talked about the years she had spent trying to fill that gap with the wrong choices. She talked about Merritt and what she had left there, naming it plainly for the first time, calling it what it was. She talked about the fear that lived just below her sternum like a pilot light that never quite went out. The fear that she had already used up whatever luck she had been given. that the rest of her life was going to be this: running, arriving, surviving, running again. And then she stopped talking and just sat there for a while. And the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the wind moved through the eaves, and the house was quiet. She had no idea that the study on the other side of the wall was not empty. Callum Reed had not been sleeping well since September. He had not been sleeping well since long before September, if he was honest, but September was when it had become undeniable, when he had taken to sitting up late in the study with a cup of tea gone cold and the ledger open in front of him, not working, just sitting. He had been a man who worked through things in silence his entire life, and he had reached a point where the silence was very full and still not producing any answers. He heard Violet that night through the plaster wall. Not clearly, not every word, but enough to understand the shape of what she was saying, the rhythm of it. He had grown up in a house with a mother who prayed, and he recognized the cadence the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in a long time, in the notes rather than the words. He sat very still. He told himself it was none of his business. He was a man who believed firmly in the separation of what was his concern and what was not, and the private grief of his cook, his employee, was categorically not his concern. But he sat in the study for a long time after her voice went quiet, with his cold tea and his open ledger, and something in him that had been clenched for a very long time was, without his permission, slightly less clenched than before. He did not say anything about it in the morning. He ate his breakfast and looked at the ridge, which was still hidden in cloud, and Violet poured his coffee and went back to the kitchen. And everything was exactly as it had been. December came. The first snow that month was the kind that came down straight and silent and covered everything so completely that the ranch looked new. Violet stood at the kitchen window the morning after and watched Callum move across the yard to the barn, his breath making white shapes in the cold air, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was the most self-contained person she had ever seen. Not cold, exactly, just sealed, like a house with all the shutters drawn that you nonetheless knew was warm inside, because the chimney was going. She was not interested in him, she told herself. She was not interested in anything that complicated right now. She was interested in getting through winter. That was the full extent of her interests. She made him a second cup of coffee and left it on the counter in case he came back in before it went cold, which was not part of her job description, and she didn't examine the impulse. He came back in at 11. The coffee was still warm. He looked at it. He looked toward the kitchen, where Violet was washing the morning dishes with her back to him. He drank the coffee, standing at the counter, and didn't say anything. That became its own kind of conversation. She started leaving the second cup. He started drinking it. Neither of them mentioned it. There were evenings, as December deepened, when Violet would find herself in the front room after dinner, mending something or reading one of the paperbacks she'd found on the shelf above the fireplace. And Callum would come in from the barn later than usual and stop for a moment in the doorway, in a way that suggested he had not expected to find the room occupied, and then sit down in the chair across from her and pick up whatever he'd been reading the night before, and they would spend an hour like that, not talking, the fire going, the wind outside doing what wind does. She did not know what to call those evenings. She did not try. What she did still, most nights, was talk in the dark after she'd gone to bed. She couldn't seem to stop it once she'd started. It was like opening a valve that had been shut too long. Not prayer exactly, not always, but a kind of running account of the day. What had been hard? What had surprised her? The small things she was grateful for, because her mother had always said you had to name them, or they slipped away. The cold. The way the light came off the snow at 3 in the afternoon. The fact that she had made it through another month. She kept her voice low. She thought she was quiet. What she did not know was that Callum had stopped going to the study on those nights. He sat in the hallway instead, in the chair that had no particular purpose there, except that someone had put it against the wall decades ago, and no one had moved it since. He sat in the dark hallway, with his back straight and his hands on his knees, and he listened to the sound of her voice through the wall, not the words, just the sound. The way it moved between sorrow and something lighter. The way it sometimes stopped and then started again, like she was finding her way as she went. He told himself he was not a man who eavesdropped. He sat in that hallway for the better part of 3 weeks. The thing that changed everything was not dramatic. It did not happen in a storm or a crisis. It happened on a Tuesday in January, which is the quietest kind of day. After a breakfast that Violet had made with dried cranberries folded into the oatmeal, because Gus had mentioned his mother used to make it that way, and she had thought it sounded worth trying. Callum ate the whole bowl and came to the kitchen door and said, "My mother put raisins in." Violet turned from the stove. "I haven't decided which is better," he said. "I can make it with raisins tomorrow," she said. "No," he said, "the cranberries are good." He went back to the table. She stood at the stove and felt something shift in the room the way the air shifts before weather. That night, in her room, she talked for a long time. She talked about how strange it was to be somewhere that felt. She hesitated over the word, then used it, safe. How she wasn't sure she trusted the feeling yet. How she was afraid of what it meant that she wanted to trust it. She talked about her mother again, and about what it was to grow up watching a woman love a piece of land and work it with everything she had, and how she had always wanted that for herself, and had spent 7 years moving away from it by mistake. She said quietly to the ceiling, "I don't know if I'm allowed to want something again." In the hallway, Callum Reed closed his eyes. He was there the next night too, and the night after that. He had stopped pretending to himself that there was another reason. He was there because listening to her was the first thing in a long time that had made the inside of his chest feel less like a room with all the furniture pushed against the walls. His wife had died 4 years ago, Eleanor. She had been sick for a year before, and he had spent that year being practical, organizing medication schedules and specialist appointments, and the business of a ranch that did not pause for grief. And then she was gone, and the practicality had nowhere to go, and he had packed it down very tightly somewhere, and continued. He had continued very effectively. He had not talked to anyone about Eleanor. He had not talked to anyone about much of anything, because he did not know how to do that, and because the land needed tending, and the cattle needed tending, and there was always something that needed tending. And eventually that became the shape of his days. He had not expected a woman with a canvas bag, and $42 and a voice that talked to the ceiling to come along and quietly undo all of that. He was annoyed about it, honestly, and then he was not. February came in hard with 3 days of blowing snow that kept everyone inside and turned the windows white, and made the ranch house feel very small and very close. Pete and Gus played cards in the bunkhouse. Violet cooked soup and biscuits and put enough in a pot for Callum, who had been in and out of the barn since 6 in the morning, checking on a mare that was close to foaling. He came in at 7 that evening, cold through to the center of himself, and she handed him a bowl without a word, and he sat at the kitchen table instead of the dining room because the kitchen was warmer, and she sat across from him with her own bowl, which was also new. She had always taken her meals in the kitchen alone, and neither of them remarked on it. "A mare?" she asked. "Waiting," he said. "Could be tonight." "Do you need help?" He looked up. "I've helped with livestock before," she said, not explaining further, which he was beginning to understand was its own kind of language she spoke. The language of "I have done more than you might expect," stated simply, with no performance attached. "I'll come get you if it goes sideways," he said. It didn't go sideways. The foal arrived at 11:15, all legs and bewilderment, and Violet was there because she had not been able to sleep and had come to the barn doorway and watched from a distance while Callum worked, quiet and sure-handed. The way she had noticed, he did everything. He looked up once and saw her. He did not tell her to leave. Afterward, when the mare and foal were settled and the barn was still, Callum sat on a hay bale with his elbows on his knees and rubbed the back of his neck, and Violet sat on the bale across from him, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was, she noticed, a different kind of silence than the one she had walked into in November. This one had room in it. "Her name was Eleanor," Callum said. Violet looked at him. "My wife." He said it to the middle distance, not to her, the way people say things they have been holding for a long time and are finally setting down somewhere. "She's the one who wanted horses. I kept the operation going after because..." He stopped. "I'm not entirely sure why." "Because it was hers," Violet said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. The barn was warm in the particular way that barns full of animals are warm. Living warmth, not the warmth of a furnace. Outside, the wind had eased. The foal tucked itself against its mother's side. "You talk at night," Callum said, through the wall. Violet went very still. "I wasn't. I could only hear the sound of it, mostly, not the words." He looked at his hands. "I should have said something, I know that. I kept meaning to." She realized she should probably be embarrassed, or alarmed, or something appropriate to the situation. She found that she was neither. She felt strangely like the pilot light beneath her sternum had just been turned up a degree. "How long?" she asked. Since November, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The night it was -18. I expect so. He met her eyes then, briefly. I want you to know I wasn't. I didn't intend to intrude. I sat in the hallway, the chair by the linen closet. A pause. I don't entirely know why I'm telling you this. I think you do, she said. He was quiet again. The foal shifted. My mother prayed, he said. It sounded like that. Violet looked at the mare, at the foal, at the clean line of hay against the stall boards. I don't know if I'd call it prayer exactly, she said. I mostly just talk about the day, about whatever I haven't been able to carry quietly. She hesitated. I didn't think anyone could hear. I should have told you sooner, he said again. Maybe, she said, but I think I needed those months to say it. She looked at him. I think I needed to say it before anyone could hear. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. They sat in the barn until close to 1 in the morning, talking the way that people talk when they have both been quiet for too long and have finally found someone who seems worth the words. Not about the past exclusively, and not about the future, but about the small precise things that make up the texture of a life. The way the plateau changed color in late afternoon. The particular difficulty of getting decent bread flour delivered this far from the highway. The name she eventually told him she'd been considering for the foal. Blail, she said. It means son. You speak French? Badly, she said. My grandmother was from Quebec. He almost smiled. She noticed. Spring arrived gradually, and then all at once, the way it does in the interior of British Columbia. Weeks of mud and snowmelt, and patches of bare ground that retreated and returned. And then one morning in late April, the hills were green. Not the dark green of summer, but the pale, almost shocked green of new growth, the color of something that had survived and was surprised about it. Violet stood at the kitchen window that morning, looking at the hills, and felt something in her chest that was not fear. It took her a moment to identify it because it had been a long time. It was something closer to hope, cautious, like a foal finding its legs. But there. Callum came in from checking on Soleil and poured his own coffee, which he did now because the second cup system had evolved into something more mutual, and stood beside her at the window. It's green, he said. Suddenly, she said. They stood there for a while, both of them looking at the hills. I was thinking, he said, that the south pasture fence is going to need work before we move the herd. All right, she said. I was thinking you might want to come along. If you were interested. She looked at him. There was nothing hidden in how he said it. That was the thing about Callum. She had noticed it early, and it had not changed. He did not say things sideways. He said them plainly and waited. And if you said no, he accepted that without argument. And if you said yes, he simply incorporated it and moved forward. It was, she had come to understand, a form of respect she hadn't known she was starving for. I'd like that, she said. He nodded. 7 o'clock. He finished his coffee and went back out to the barn. She turned back to the window and looked at the green hills and thought about her mother, who had worked land and loved it, and about the woman she had been in November, with her canvas bag and $42, and about the conversation in the barn and everything that had come after. Slowly, at a pace she could trust, without any doors being forced. She had told Callum, sometime in March, about Merritt, not all of it in one sitting, but piece by piece, on evenings when the front room was quiet and the fire was going, and it felt safe enough to put words to things. He had listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interjecting, and when she was done, he had not offered reassurances or commentary or advice. He had said simply, "You did the right thing, leaving." 4 words. She had carried them for 2 weeks. It was not a love story the way love stories are usually told. There was no single moment she could point to, no declaration over a dramatic backdrop. It was more like the way light changes in a long interior afternoon. Gradually, and then you look up and realize everything is different and you can't say exactly when it happened. By May, she was not afraid anymore, not the way she had been. The pilot light was still there, because she thought it probably always would be. You do not come through the things she had come through and arrive at fearlessness on the other side. But it was no longer all she felt. It had company now. By June, she had stopped thinking of the room off the back hallway as her room, and started thinking of the ranch house as a place she lived. By the end of that summer, when the plateau was dry and gold, and the light came in long and low, in the late afternoons and Soleil was nearly full-grown in the south pasture, Violet Ashford was making plans for the following spring, which seeds to order, which section of the kitchen garden to expand. And it occurred to her one evening, standing at the stove with the window open and the sound of the ranch at dusk coming in with the breeze, that she had stopped calculating how much money she had and how long it would last. She had not noticed when that happened. Callum came in and set his hat on the hook and washed his hands at the sink and looked at what she was making and said, "Smells good." "Sit down," she said. "It's almost ready." He sat. He watched her at the stove the way she had once watched him move across the yard toward the barn. Not with longing exactly, but with the particular attention you give to things you have decided to keep. She set the pot on the table and sat across from him, and they ate dinner as the light went gold outside the window, and the house was warm, and the ranch was theirs. The horses and the fences and the kitchen garden and the long winters and the sudden springs. All of it, together, built quietly out of two people who had needed to be heard before they could learn how to speak. I keep thinking about the night Violet stood in that barn, long after the foal had settled, and finally heard back from the silence she'd been talking into for months. Not from God, not from the universe. From a man who had been sitting in a dark hallway in a wooden chair, just listening. Because he didn't know how to say anything yet, but he knew enough not to walk away. That's the part that stays with me. There's something I've come to believe, slowly and not without resistance. The way we treat the quietest moments of our lives, the ones nobody sees, the ones we think don't count, that's where our real character lives. Violet didn't talk in the dark because she thought anyone was listening. She did it because she was trying to stay honest with herself, trying to name things accurately so they didn't grow sideways in the dark. That kind of integrity, the kind you practice when no one's watching, doesn't announce itself. But it shapes everything that comes after. Callum heard it and recognized it, the way you recognize something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking. And Callum. He had every excuse to stay sealed up. He'd lost Eleanor. He'd built a life around function and distance and the reliable company of land and weather. Nobody would have blamed him for staying exactly as he was. But there was something in him that was still paying attention, still capable of being moved. And when Violet's voice came through the wall that November night, he didn't ignore it. He sat in that chair, night after night, not because he was hoping for something, just because it felt like the right thing to do. That's a kind of quiet courage that doesn't get talked about much. The courage to let something matter again after you've decided it's safer not to. What happened between them wasn't luck. I don't think it was fate either, not in any grand sense. It was consequence. Violet left Merritt because staying would have cost her everything she had left. That took nerve, real nerve, the kind that doesn't feel brave in the moment, just necessary. She showed up at a stranger's door with almost nothing and asked for work, not sympathy. And she kept showing up, every morning at 5:15, doing the job well because doing it well was what she had. That consistency, that refusal to let hard circumstances make her small. That's what earned her a place in that house, and eventually in that life. I think about the second cup of coffee she left on the counter, the cranberries in the oatmeal, the way she sat across from Callum in the kitchen during the storm without making a thing of it. None of those moments were calculated. They were just thoughtful. Small acts of attention that accumulated into something neither of them had planned. That's how I think real things are built. Not in the dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones where you choose to be decent and present and honest, even when it's easier not to be. Violet wanted to trust the feeling of safety. She wasn't sure she was allowed to want things again. I understand that. Most of us have been in some version of that place, standing at the edge of something good, waiting for it to be taken away. The difference is whether you step forward anyway. She did. Callum did. Not recklessly. Slowly, carefully. At a pace that respected what they'd both been through. By summer, the ranch was theirs. Not because the story demanded a happy ending, but because two people had, independently and then together, chosen to keep showing up with honesty and care, and the willingness to be changed by what they heard. That seems like enough of a reason to me.